So it's now my job to introduce Sarosh Kuruvilla, who's going to improve on this. Blue Deal refers to an environmental measure, a fictional environmental measure at the European level, and we're going to ask, and Sarosh is going to try to answer, what is this? How do we account? How do we know what works for workers? How do we know through analysis what's working on a large scale to improve workers' lives, working conditions, advance worker rights? So the measuring of this is crucial, if a little complicated and boring sometimes. Okay, so Sarosh is the academic director at the Global Labor Institute, but in his day job is the Nathanson Professor of Industrial Relations at the ILR school here at Cornell. He's my partner in this GLI enterprise, and has literally written the book, or one of the books, on private regulations, its ups, its downs, and today's presentation is at least in part from work that we've been doing, that Sarosh has been doing over the last decade. Sarosh.
Thanks and welcome, folks. After the morning's panel, which was interesting, lively, high level, I'm here to talk about plumbing. The plumbing that actually underlies the implementation of this ambitious new series of legislations in Europe, both the Norwegian law, French law, the German law, and the twin CSRD and CSDDD laws that are in force. And so so we're essentially talking about plumbing here. And I hope you can, sustain the presentation. Plumbing is not always interesting. Okay, so to start, we've been doing research on private regulation for a long time. And Jason and I were talking about a year and a half ago and sort of saying, look, companies have glossy, brochures, etc., that talk about what they do, the wonderful programs that they have, and it's on their website and so on and so forth. But the question we were asking is, how do we know whether those programs work? What's the evidence? And so we decided that we would try and develop some metrics on labor that could actually be used as a gauge of company progress, and so see whether that can be put out there. We were also concerned with the environmental side. The environmental side was going ahead and developing metrics, because some metrics are easy. Carbon capture, emissions, these are easier to measure. And people always said the things on the S side were difficult to measure. We didn't have metrics. And I'm sort of saying, come on, I'm from a labor relations school. We've been measuring things like this for a long time. And so maybe we should develop those measures. So what we are arguing for is a set of outcome measures, not input descriptions, because the existing reporting mechanisms, the Global Reporting Initiative and others, all require companies to report in excruciating detail what their programs are and what they do. But they don't require companies to sort of actually show that these programs have effect. A little louder. Okay. So parsimony, a set of 20 metrics should substitute for the long books that regulators will have to read about company programs and what they do, right? So that's the goal. So one characteristic of our metrics, they're quantitative, they're easy to use, they're easy to read, you can look at them in a page, so on and so forth. So that's the parsimony side. On the utility side of it, we're arguing that for companies in particular, per the new legislation, they're supposed to do due diligence, right? And that's a pretty heavy lift because you have to actually identify all kinds of risks. And so the metrics become really useful in risk analysis. The second is that for regulators, I mean, for companies also, the metrics become useful to test their progress over time. And one of the aspects of the EU legislation is that they do look at progress over time. Okay. For regulators, this is a really good way of sort of looking at the metrics, is to sort of look at how companies are doing across time. For ESG investors, it's an relatively easy way to sort of see whether these risks are material or not by looking at data that the metrics underlie. So the argument I'm going to be making is that this is utility, that it really works for a lot of people, a lot of the stakeholders in many different ways. The third aspect of our metrics is that they are relevant. They are based on research that others, giants before us, have done on freedom of association, labor rights, but they're also based on our own research on company supply chains. Corporations have shared data with us on a non-disclosure basis. We have looked at that data, we have analyzed it. And so the metrics that we are suggesting are in use inside companies, right? And so it's not difficult to collect. The fourth characteristics of our metrics is that we design them with the garment industry in mind, but we realize that they are generalizable to, they are sector agnostic, so to speak. There are some metrics that are particularly relevant to garment industries, the apparel industry, but there are, some that are not, but most of them are generalizable to every industry. Before I get into the metrics, what's an example of a metric, an outcome metric that can be used by companies both for risk analysis as well as for evaluating progress? So gender discrimination has been a core human right, right? And most companies have plans and descriptions on how they want to achieve gender discrimination, to regulate and reduce gender discrimination in the supply chain. So I'm sort of saying, hey, just tell us simply what's male-female wages in the supply chain. What is it today? Where is it going tomorrow? And what's it going to be? What is it tomorrow? Right? And so that's an outcome metric. It's simple. It's something that everybody understands, and it's quantifiable so that you can measure progress. So that's an example of an outcome metric that we've all known about, but has just not been used. And why not? Right? And so why can't companies report this? This is, I think, European regulation will want companies to report it if they are going to evaluate them on have you done a good risk analysis or not. Okay, so that's the background to this presentation. We have developed metrics on sourcing, on the workforce, on working conditions, on work climate impacts. This is what DIE's Article 15, about the new mandatory due diligence legislation on climate impacts on workers, representation rights that you all know about here, and a little bit on the collection of information, which is about audits. And so I'm not going to talk about all of them in detail. I'll point out a few, give you a flavor. There's a handout floating around that gives you the complete list. So I want to talk a bit about this because, or the sourcing metrics, because we've studied the German law, and the German law is amazingly precise about what it requires, and the guidance that it has is pretty detailed. So if you go to the BAFA website, you can actually read this guidance. So we have a measure like overall sourcing risk. It's a sourcing share by volume by country. And German law has this principle of appropriateness criteria number 1, which is, risks from country, sector, and product. And so the companies are supposed to sort of estimate the risk from country, sector, or product. If you are in China, there is immediately a risk of freedom of association violations, right? Because the country is, so it's fairly simple. The German law is also particularly relevant, good about looking at principle of appropriateness criteria number 2, which is, does the company have the influence to change what is happening in the supply chain? And the measure of that is leverage. How much of a factory's product does a company buy? And the German law is actually, amazing. It says not every company will know what their leverage percentage is. But the German law also says in time they will get there, right? And so leverage percentage, many apparel brands know their leverage percentage in many factories today. They know it pretty well. But so that's why leverage is a metric that we have to use. Again, going back to the German law, they talk about causal factors as another criteria. And they write that, the quality of relationships with the buyers, how the length of buyer turnover, the amount of buyer turnover is a risk. And then that requires companies to report on buyer turnover. Is your supply chain stable? Is it not? So that becomes something that you have to report. Sourcing and labor performance alignment. This is, do companies, again, this is the principle of effectiveness criteria from the German law, asking the question, do companies have the internal management systems to ensure that their purchasing practices are not the cause of violations of labor in the supply chain, right? And so this is fairly easy. You look at sourcing volumes over time on the supplier, and you correlate that with compliance scores. And the argument here is very simple. Are suppliers who do well on labor compliance, are they getting more orders over time? Now, all companies are supposed to sort of have this in their management systems. But even our analysis of corporate data indicate that many companies, these are not integrated, they're not aligned. And so that kind of alignment is now going to have to be demonstrated, in these reporting metrics that the German law evidently clearly requires. Okay, so these are the sourcing ones. And I spent a little time on it because, I was quite amazed when I started analyzing the German labor law and the guidance that comes along with it, that they're very precise, right? Okay. On workforce metrics here also, the law is quite detailed. It tells you that, in order to analyze your risk, the percentage of migrant workers in the factory is an indicator of risk. The percentage of temporary workers in the factory is an indicator of risk. Or the female pay as a percentage of male pay for same comparable jobs and tenures is another risk indicator. In the apparel industry, we know that most factories are full of female workers, and much of management is male. So the risk of gender-based violence, sexual harassment is high. And so by definition, a company would have to report as part of their risk analysis, the workforce. And if the workforce is primarily female, then you immediately are at risk for gender-based violence. How do you counteract this risk? Well, one of the ways, there's lots of education and training that you can do. But one quantitative measure, one way in which you could potentially reduce the risk is to ensure that the percentage of female supervisors is on parity with the percentage of female workers in the workforce, right? So these are, again, useful metrics that reduce company risk, but also indicate company progress over time. And so as companies do a lot to ensure that the percentage of supervisors, in both in their own workforce as well as in the supply chain, remember the German law applies to both, then this is an indicator of progress as well. So that's another utility of these metrics. We have working conditions metrics. This audience needs no introduction to how do you measure working conditions, and particularly wages. We've talked about in the morning about living wages, but yes, at a minimum, companies should be reporting for their supply chains, monthly production worker pay, disaggregated with bonus deductions, overtime, things like that, right? Which nobody does now. I mean, they know it, but they don't show it, right? So the German law, in very simple words, the German law is really moving us towards, show and tell from a current practice where people just tell but don't show. Right? So that's the metrics help in doing that. Accidents, grievances are now required. Again, under the German law, it's a risk assessment indicator, but it's also an evidence of effectiveness of the right to remedy. Okay, moving on. Freedom of association. Here, what's the metric? And this requires judgment. Maybe if companies are going to use auditors, and auditors have to make that judgment. If companies are using their own officers, they have to make that judgment. Is there the share of workers in activist unions? And an activist union is one that actually bargains and challenges management on fundamental issues. I mean, that's the judgment you have to make. And collective bargaining agreement presence, is the workers covered by that collective bargaining agreement? That agreement's negotiated provisions have to be better than what the minimums are in the law. So these two metrics go together because one leads to the other. And so the judgment, again, is for due diligence purposes, you have to ensure that the collective bargaining agreement is genuine, it is above the minimum legal provisions. Because in China, etc., there are hundreds and hundreds of formalistic collective bargaining agreements that mean nothing at all, right? Again, on workplace representation, worker chosen candidates are that's the metric that is important. Are they chosen by workers rather than chosen by management? And then there's also workplace governance by gender, especially in apparel, where all the workers are female. Okay, so that's example of representation metrics. Then we come to climate. Until now, climate has been a separate issue. Labor has been a separate issue. The law talks about climate mitigation, and asks companies to report on what they are doing to mitigate their footprint on the environment. We, as a result of research that you will hear this afternoon by Jason and Angus, we're interested in climate adaptation. How do we adapt to as we change? How do we protect workers in that process? And so we have several measures or metrics connected with measuring the impact of climate change on workers. One is about heat. The number of days in which the indoor wet bulb globe temperature, that's a measure of, temperature plus humidity. And, and this measure needs to be, factories don't measure this on a regular basis. National laws do not require it, except in one or two countries. But the basic idea is above 32 WG wet bulb globe temperature, you're supposed to be working for an hour and resting for half an hour. Well, that's the level. So it's important to have a measure of that. Same thing with intense flooding. As you will hear in the afternoon, much of the world's garment factories are at susceptible risk for flooding that could affect their survival and exports and all of that in those countries. So yes, is there a flood plan in place? Do workers get paid for paid breaks as if due to heat? Do they get paid if they show up late because the roads are flooded and the buses are running late? Or is their pay get docked? So these are really important kinds of metrics that look at the effect of climate on workers. Okay. Finally, the last set is about information gathering. I want to say that the threat of civil liability in the French law, the threat of civil liability that is implicit in the CSDD law, this is the one that is going to force companies to take their due diligence duties really seriously. It's going to be a heavy lift. You're going to have to collect a lot of data, both in terms to analyze whether there's violation, but also in terms of showing progress. And so I think all companies covered by the law will up their game in terms of getting the data, the thing to prove that they're okay. But audits will also have to improve. And the auditing industry is also quite under the gun here. Right? So these are measures of disclosure. They're metrics that require people to disclose who the auditors are. Because right now, companies are not bound to disclose them. Second, the duration of the audit. The average audit in apparel is 1 or 2 days. And in 1 or 2 days, in a 1,000-worker factory, there is very limited amount of information that you can unearth. And then who pays for the audit? Because there's been a tendency to get the suppliers to pay the auditors, and that sets up the grounds for collusion. So I just think the transparency helps. But let's go back to the threat of civil liability. I guess you all might have heard that report. When the transposition of the CSRD law happened into the French government, it just happened, just announced a few days ago, the punishment for violation of CSRD in France can go up to, it's a criminal violation, I think, and go up to a fine of 75,000 euros, but also the imprisonment of the chief executive of the company. So that's France. Now you might say, well, that's France. But civil liability can take different, the punishments. Each of the countries have the latitude to figure out their own punishment. So some cases it could be imprisonment. There are other countries in Europe that might take a similar view, but at least there'll be lawsuits, right? So this intelligence gathering process to which we are contributing to in our plumbing presentation is going to be a big issue. And so our goal here is to influence different regulators over the next 2 years as they take in, they enact the law in their own countries, and hope that they will include some of the metrics in that process. Thanks.